All right. Uh, this is now going to be the second time I've recorded these videos. The first time, I just realized I recorded all of the Entra videos with my microphone muted, so none of the audio captured, and here we are. So hopefully this is the polished version and second run through, but this is going to be the Entra ID section about comparing Microsoft 365, Entra, and Azure. These products are kind of combined into similar topics, so they're commonly confused, and it's good to understand an overview of the differences between the three and how they fit together. So that's what this topic is going to cover. It's kind of like a 101 introduction to the three. I'm not going to go into anything into too much detail, and especially for Entra, I'm going to be covering that in detail in the next few videos. So we're just going to touch on this, go over how to separate the three components because they are three individual pieces that all kind of happen within Azure and Microsoft cloud services. And with that, we will jump right in. So switching over to my super crafty whiteboard here. Give me 1 second. All right. First, we're going to talk about uh, Microsoft slash Office 365. So this is probably the most common um, part of the Microsoft Cloud offering for businesses that everybody knows about because this is going to be the user facing content. Microsoft slash Office 365. I'm just going to refer to this as Microsoft 365, though technically that talks about a specific set of licenses, not all of them. Sometimes it's Office 365. It's confusing. So 365, Microsoft 365 is your end user facing applications. So your SaaS offerings, that's going to be Word, Outlook, Excel, online and desktop versions, and specifically the licensing behind them. So I like to think of 365 as kind of your end user applications, but also specifically your end user data or data that belongs to individual users rather than the company or organization as a whole. I also like to consider this in terms of specifically SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. And I bring those up as specific examples because so much of 365's user storage occurs on a SharePoint backbone. You have SharePoint sites, which are used by your user departments to create pages, right, and to host files, lists, whatever you want to do with SharePoint. You have teams, which every team is also associated on the back end with a SharePoint site, so it utilizes SharePoint storage for your team's channels and also integrations. And then you have OneDrive, which is also backed by SharePoint and it's used for syncing SharePoint for OneDrive for Business or for hosting individual user data. But all that is powered on the back end by SharePoint storage. So anytime I think of 365, I think of SharePoint, I think of end users, and I think of licensing. And just to give you a little overview here, let's pull up uh, license comparison. Sorry, I didn't have this up and ready ahead of time. Bring this over here. And we want to do for business. And here you get your Microsoft 365 licenses. Like I said, we don't need to go into too much detail about this, but I just want to compare your license you pay per user and comes with a set of software, and these are the sort of services that are included with Microsoft 365. And you'll see you've got your user applications. Now you'll also notice there are Entra ID licenses, and some of those that does not mean that this is associated with Entra. It just there will cover some of those advanced licenses later. It just comes with extra features, usually security related for Entra and management. So that's 365. The other part that we'll talk about next is going to be your Azure side of things. Now, one of the easiest ways for me to know if someone has experience using Azure products specifically is, or actually, one of the easiest ways for me to tell they don't have any experience or have very limited experience is you will talk about Azure and they will bring up something related to 365, usually license related, maybe Windows Defender for Cloud, or you'll be talking about your Exchange license, or they'll say, "Oh, I've got a developer or sandbox license for Azure," and you go to look at it, and it's actually just the developer versions of the 365 portal, which have absolutely nothing to do with Azure. It is confusing, and I think that's one of the reasons that Microsoft recently renamed Azure AD from Azure AD to Entra, is to separate those a little bit more and get more clarity. Azure is really going to be referring to Microsoft's uh, basically data center and a cloud type technology. You've got your IaaS components, which is going to be your virtual machines, your backend compute, your virtual network connectivity, VPNs, that sort of thing. That's going to be your IaaS component. You also have your PaaS services like Azure SQL, Azure Storage accounts, and then tied into that, you have your own set of role-based access controls specifically for these resources, for your management groups, for your subscriptions. That's all tied into basically you running your own data center instance in Azure. And that is Azure, and that is very independent from 365, which are all user-facing. A great way to distinguish these also, if you're using cloud terms, is 365 is more of a SaaS offering, software as a service, where users can use that software from the internet, whereas Azure is more of your IaaS and PaaS services. There's a little bit of crossover, but for the most part, that's a pretty clear delineation between the two. We'll talk about Azure more, so let's go right on to the last component, the topic of this series, and that's going to be Entra. Now, I put Entra right in the middle in kind of these overlapping spheres because it does have kind of legs in both arenas, and it does have uh, pieces that extend and get kind of gray area between Entra and Azure and Entra and 365. From an Entra and 365 area, the overlap really oftentimes occurs in your administrator roles because you're granting admin roles in Entra that grants permissions in Entra, but that also grants a lot of admin permissions for 365. Global admin is the obvious one, but you also have things like Intune Administrator. I consider Intune to be more of a 365 service because it's managing end user devices and the configuration on them, but the Intune Administrator grants you ability to create groups in Entra and also is just an Entra active or integrated role. So there's some gray area there, and similar to Azure, in Entra you assign Entra roles, but you can also use Entra identities to assign Azure roles. You need to have a user or service principal, something in Entra, in order to be able to assign an RBAC permission to that identity to a resource in Azure. So there's gray area. It stands up in between, but Entra I like to think of specifically as your identity service. You also might know the term AAA, authorization, uh, authentication, and accounting. I have this in the wrong order. Authentication, authorization, accounting, meaning your sign-in attempts happen against Entra where your identities are. What you have permissions to is tied to Entra, and then accounting is audit logs or sign-in logs. That's all part of Entra. And at its core, Entra is your identity database. Think of this as your Active Directory for your cloud services. That's why it used to be Azure AD. It really is that central source of all of your identity and authentication. You've got users, you've got devices, which are a little bit different from Active Directory. We'll talk about that in, I think, the next video covering Entra identities. You've got groups. You have applications or service principals, which we'll talk about quite a bit as well, because it's good to understand how those function, what they are, that sort of thing. And then lastly, you have your roles for Entra, and that's roles that allow you to create or manage identities or different Entra components. Like I said, we're going to get into a lot more detail in the next few videos. I just wanted to cover first kind of the separation between these three components because it is important to know. Also, it will help you as you're talking about or having conversations about the different cloud aspects, not to get these terms confused, because if you're talking with someone who has a lot of experience, it's going to be a red flag to them if you can't separate these correctly. Our next video that we're going to be covering is in Entra Identities, where we're going to talk more about users and computers. That will be coming up next. Thanks.